This morning, we're going to be in Colossians chapter 3. I was sitting in the living room with my wife, I think it was Thursday evening, if I remember right. We're sitting there doing, I'm assuming, exactly what Paul had in mind in Ephesians 5 for married couples. I'm looking at Facebook, and she's looking at Pinterest, I think. We occasionally run across something interesting, screenshot it, text it to the person who's 6 feet away, laugh at the memes and all of that stuff. And Nathan walks in from the college group thing, and he says, my key fob is not working right on my car. And I'll hit it like 5 or 6 times, and nothing happens. And I'm thinking, it's probably the battery or whatever, but we have a spare one. I said, just switch it out with the spare one that's in the drawer, and we'll take care of it later. And then I go back to Facebook, the important thing, and I scroll for about 30 seconds, and there is an ad for key fobs. I kid you not, as I'm scrolling through, and I thought they're listening to me as I go through here. But as I'm scrolling through, one of the things that I've run across in the last week or so, somebody in my hometown of Mobile, Alabama, has made a Mobile Nostalgia of the 80s Facebook group, and everybody is sharing all of these things from when I was a kid. And for all of us, we kind of grew up in different eras, so some of yours will go back further and all of that. And even within that group, there's like the old ones of us that grew up in the 80s, and then the older ones they're talking about when those were dirt roads and stuff like that. But as they would see all these different things, I would get nostalgic about something. Somebody posted a picture of the theater that I saw Return of the Jedi when I was 10 years old. And I had totally forgotten which theater I had gone to, but it all came back all of a sudden. People were posting different stores and restaurants and things at schools and things around town. And I found myself, like a lot of us do at one time or another, you get kind of nostalgic for the past. And every time I thought I kind of hit the peak of it, then somebody posted the 2 giant toy stores we had in town that I had totally forgotten about. And I remember going there before Christmas and picking out the things that would be on the Christmas list and all of that. And each of us kind of has this nostalgia for different things. And if you don't yet, you will, I promise. But you'll have this is how it used to be, this is what it was at one time. And sometimes we get kind of caught up in, we almost think of it as a little better than it really was. I would imagine if you were to drop me into Mobile in 1983 going to see Return of the Jedi, I probably would think, well, this is not exactly how I remembered it. I'd probably miss my stadium seating as somebody's head was in front of me. I'd probably see things a lot differently than they actually were when I was a kid taking that all in for the first time. For us, when it comes to church life, when it comes to our spiritual walk, we do the same kind of thing, where you have kind of this thing in your mind of how it used to be. And we talked a little bit about the idea of tradition last time and the rules of men and all of those things. Sometimes we will think back and think, I remember how it was, and it was so great and so wonderful, and there were pieces of it that were. But one of the big messages of Paul here in Colossians chapter 3 is, the best is yet to come. Don't get so caught in what it used to be that you forget, one, that there are also problems with what used to be. And a lot of us, if we were to think of ourselves as the people we once were versus the people we are today, and then the people we hope to become, we would probably be a little quicker to let go of some of those past things. And so in Colossians chapter 3, Paul kind of addresses this idea. Starting in verse 1, maybe, there we go. If then you have been raised with Christ, seek the things that are above, where Christ is seated at the right hand of God. Set your mind on things that are above, not on things that are on earth. So Paul gives us in these couple verses 2 commands. And if you're a grammar person or you liked English class, the few among us, my wife has an English degree, so she loved English somewhere along the way. It's the imperative case, which is when somebody tells you to do something, this is what it is. And so Paul has these 2 commands that come through the Spirit in verses 1 and 2. First of all, seek things that are above. So the idea is there's all this stuff within the world that we tend to get caught up on. And Paul says instead of that, start looking towards things that are from heaven. Or as the sermon title says, be heavenly minded. Be people that are looking to things above. And then secondly, set your mind on things that are above. So your focus, your goal, the things you're shooting for becomes this above instead of the things of earth. And then secondly, where does your mind go? So I don't even want to know the answer to this question. I would imagine just on occasion during a sermon, your mind begins to wander a little bit. I don't understand why, because it's all great. But sometimes you feel like something else comes in there. And I would imagine for some of you, maybe it's a godly kind of thing. Maybe it's you heard something in Colossians 3:2, which made you think of something in Romans that took you in another direction, and you're all over the place probably with a better sermon in your mind than the one I'm preaching. And then others of you, it is, I'm kind of hungry right now, and I'm thinking of Thanksgiving later in the week, or I'm thinking of if you're doing something with the banquet today, what work you still have to do, or there are all these things going through our mind. Monday is work, sorry, it's coming. You have all this stuff that's going on. And so Paul says, seek things above, and then set your mind on things above. So what if, when our minds began to drift, they drifted to things that are godly things, spiritual things? And I would imagine, even me as a preacher, I mean, this is what I do. My mind doesn't always drift there. My mind drifts to all kinds of different places. Even as I sit here sometimes, my mind will go one place or another. What if our minds began to become so set that when they drift toward God? And that ultimately is what Paul tries to lead us to in a lot of different places in his writings. If you think of in Philippians chapter 2, he describes what that mindset on God, that mindset on things above, what it looks like. He says, have this mind among yourselves, which is yours in Christ Jesus, who, though he was in the form of God, did not count equality with God a thing to be grasped, or a thing to be leveraged in his favor, or a thing to be used. And I will tell you, if I had equality with God, I have a whole new place for my mind to drift to now. My mind would be there all the time of the things I could do and what I could fix and all of that. You may have noticed as you were driving in this morning, there's a banner out front here that says, come join us at 8 o'clock, or at 10 o'clock, sorry. And it's got our website on there. And I thought, as I looked out there a couple weeks ago, here's this banner stand we use like 3 times a year. Why don't we just put something up there? So I ordered a banner, put it up there. And when I got here this morning at a little after 8, someone thought it would be fun to cut the zip ties that were holding the banner up on one side. And I thought, they were probably trying to take it and got interrupted. I have no idea what you do with a banner that has our church website on it that says, come join us at 10. That's not how you invite people to your party or whatever. Anyhow, it's out there, and I thought, and if I had the equality with God, I would tell you right now who did it, and we would be at their house and having them come fix it or whatever. We would do all kinds of things with equality with God. Jesus doesn't consider it something to be held on to, even though he's got it. And instead, he emptied himself, taking the form of a servant, being in the likeness of men. So what begins with mindset then turns into action on Jesus' behalf. The mindset of, I'm not going to hang on to this, becomes a mindset that says, I'm going to be a servant, which doesn't fit if you have equality with God. And then I'm going to be in human likeness. I'm going to be here with men. And being found in human form, he humbled himself by becoming obedient to the point of death, even death on a cross. So his mindset turns into action. So if our seeking goes to heavenly things, and then our minds go to heavenly things, it's going to affect our actions here on earth. Now, maybe I'm alone on this, but I have seen and heard a lot of times people pull this set your mind on things above, or focus on things above, seek things above, out of context. And we get so focused on things above that we forget we're here. And so I think we have the two extremes there. What Paul talked about toward the end of chapter 2, which is this nostalgia, this rules of the world, these things of the past, don't get so planted there that you miss the present. And then for us, yes, set your minds and your thoughts ahead to what God has in store for you and to who God is and to his goals. But if you do those things, it's going to affect what you do here. So when we say, people have probably asked you somewhere along the way, what is your goal in life? And I've heard the answer many times from church people, to get to heaven and to take as many people with me as I can, something along those lines. And I hope we will reset ourselves a little bit to the idea that heaven is not the goal, heaven is the reward for having achieved the goal. The goal is, as Jesus says, what's the greatest command? Love God, love others. That is the goal of how we are to live life. And as we live life that way and follow God and set our minds on things above, The reward is heaven. But there's much to be done here. In Philippians 4:8, a little bit of the idea of what this thought of things above looks like. Finally, brothers, whatever is true, whatever is honorable, whatever is just, whatever is pure, whatever is lovely, whatever is commendable, if there is any excellence, if there is anything worthy of praise, think about these things. And I love that Paul doesn't begin with do that stuff, because that's probably where most of us will want to jump to. But think about these things. This is where our mind should be. So if we're thinking like Jesus, if we're thinking like God would have us to think, these are the things that we are thinking about. And so when someone wrongs us, our immediate thought is not vengeance. Our immediate thought is not how messed up those people are or whatever. Our immediate thought should be whatever is true, whatever is honorable, whatever is right. Think about these things. This will also change our mindset here. So our actions here on earth, as we look to things above, they're changed. And then our thinking, our mindset is also changed. So the way we interact with the world, the way we see the world, the way we think about people and things and the activities of life is different than the way the world around us thinks about those things. And that's kind of a struggle when we think nostalgic, especially those of us who are, I don't know, my age or a little bit older. This world was very different when we were growing up. And the rules and the standards and all of those things of the world were a lot more like the ones that we appreciate from Scripture than they are today. And yet our thinking, regardless of what our world is doing, is to be different. It's to be on things above. So in verse 3 he says, "For you have died, and your life is hidden with Christ in God. When Christ, who is your life, appears, then you also will appear with him in glory." So we had the imperatives, the two imperatives. Now I want you to think of these definite statements, these definitive things that we have heard within these first 4 verses. First of all, Christ is at the right hand of God. So everybody who may be among the community there who thinks, well, isn't he talking about the guy who was crucified and put to death, and clearly he didn't win? And Paul says, oh no, Christ is at the right hand of God. And then secondly, you have died. Now clearly they're not physically dead, but they have died through baptism, because it's the ones who are in Christ that he's talking about there in verse 1. We have died to the old way of life. What used to be is gone. So you have died to that, and then you have been raised to something different. Christ will appear in glory. So you have all these kind of present and past tense things, and then suddenly Christ will appear in glory, and you will appear with him. So all of these things they just are. This is how it is. You've died to what you used to be. You're something different now. And there's going to be this reward that comes as a result of that. And then he says in verse 5, "Put to death, therefore, what is earthly in you." So you have the therefore here, and we point these out from time to time. The therefore is because of what you have just read. So because of everything we have read to this point in the letter to the Colossians, you put to death the old. Not to earn what he has just talked about. So the fact that Christ is at the right hand of God, the fact that Christ will be glorified, the fact that we will be with him, we're not going to not do the stuff he's about to talk about, and we're not going to change the things he's going to talk about because we're trying to earn that, but because those things have happened. And that's a hard thing for us. That's not, maybe your experience has been different than mine, that's not the church I grew up in. The church I have always been a part of, especially early in life, was very focused on to be okay, you've got to do these things. And so we come to the question, if you've not been here on Wednesday night, the idea of forgiveness of sins. Do we really believe that we have forgiveness of sins? Well, if we believe God, we're supposed to believe we have forgiveness of sins. And last Wednesday we talked about from 1 John chapter 5, he wants us to know that. Doesn't want us to wonder, doesn't want us to hope for it. He wants us to know that if we're in Christ, we have forgiveness of sins. And so because of that, we live life differently than other people would. We don't live life differently than other people would to get the forgiveness of sins. We don't reverse it. We do this in the order in which God says. So because of this, you're going to put to death the old self. Put to death, therefore, what is earthly in you: sexual immorality, impurity, passion, evil desire, covetousness, which is idolatry. Now, although you could pull a couple of these out and make them about other things, it seems like what Paul is talking about here is sexual sin. He continues on in verse 6, on account of these, the wrath of God is coming. In these, you too once walked when you were living in them. So these sexual sins that are going on within the world in which they live. And again, this is a place where we have always had this within culture, but there was a time in culture that society felt like these things were as wrong as we did. And that time is long gone, isn't it? You know, these things it's almost like the society to-do list now. It's not the stay away from these things list. It is, society is all about this stuff. And when you turn on your TV or you're scrolling through your phone or whatever, it hits you in the face sometimes, doesn't it? It's just all around you. And our struggle has become, it makes its way into the church if we're not careful. Because all of those standards of the world that we have relied on for so long because they were similar to ours, they're not the same anymore. And so what we're growing up is a world that says, well, you know, sex outside of marriage, that's not a big deal. Everybody does that. And yet scripturally, nothing has changed there. The idea that people live together before they get married, totally fine in our world today. Scripturally, not so much. Now, our other struggle with this is, notice how he finished that. In these you too once walked when you were living in them. So he reminds them, you were there. And for their culture at that day and time, you know, before these people became religious people, the different gods that were worshipped, some of the gods, that was their thing. And so part of the worshiping of God was some of this stuff, the gods that they worshiped. They were all a part of this, and now they have been called on to change. And so if you are here and you hate it when this kind of stuff comes up in a sermon because you feel guilt and all of those things, I hope we have explained well at this point, you are not supposed to have to hang on to that guilt. When you have been forgiven, you have been forgiven. Now, I understand that you have probably seen the looks. You've probably felt the judgment that comes from others, and I'm sorry for that. I don't think that's who we are called to be. You, like these people in Colossae, can look at that as something that was in your past and that you are a different person now because that person has been put to death and you were someone else. Or if you were on the early side of this, you can look at this and say, these are the things that I want to avoid. These are the things I don't want to be a part of. And he moves beyond just the idea of sexual sin too. In verse 8, he says, but now you must put them all away. Anger. Okay, why does it matter how we think as people of God? This is where anger lives, isn't it? It's in your thoughts. And you're thinking of all the different things you can do and all the different ways you can get even and all of the ways that somebody can get what's coming to them. And we will get so focused in on anger, or someone has wronged you. And every time you see them, all you can think about is what they have done to you, and that anger just rests there. And wrath, sometimes you act on that wrath. And malice, so we do things maliciously, where our intent is bad towards someone else. And oftentimes we assume the same of them because that's kind of the way we feel. Slander. How many times do we either say something untrue about someone else or participate in the conversation and allow someone else to be maligned and slandered as we are there in obscene talk? Now, I don't know exactly how to define this throughout time. There are a lot of people that feel like, well, why is this word a curse word and this word is not? I think some of them are probably pretty obvious. But at the same time, there are a lot of things that when you say and you see like your grandma react and you think, well, it wasn't their day and time. And so they still kind of hang on to that. It all shifts with time, doesn't it? But are the things that we are saying, are they good and upbuilding? Are they negative and bad? Are they obscene in this case? All of these other behaviors, get these things behind you. Don't do them anymore. Do not lie to one another. Do not lie to one another. How often do we do this? In both big ways and small ways. You know, how often have you told a lie to avoid the longer conversation that would come about because of truth? How often have you told a lie in an attempt to get yourself out of trouble? How often have you told a lie because you thought, well, it doesn't affect anyone else, I'll just say this, and you've convinced yourselves there are all these different levels. Be an honest person. Do not be dishonest. Do not lie to one another, seeing that you have put off the old self. So when you are baptized into Christ, that death that takes place, there is a who you used to be and what you used to do. And for some of us who are baptized young enough, I was in 8th grade, I probably was not an awful person as an 8th grader. I probably didn't have the authority, the power, the money, anything else to be an awful person. I just kind of had to do what my parents told me to do and all those kinds of things. And so I'm not a horrible person, and yet at the same time, there is a version of me that could be if I were not in Christ, and then the version that should be because I am. And which one of those am I going to live out? So Paul says, put to death the old self with its practices. So all of this personal sin that you have, the anger and the malice, some of the thought things that go on, and then the relational sin, both the sexual stuff he talks about at the beginning, and then also the lying and slander and all of those things. Don't do those things anymore because that's not who you are. You are someone who has been raised to a new and different life. So think of what he tells us here to do. First of all, put to death what is earthly. So I don't think we have to look far to consider what this is. If you watch TV, watch the commercials a little bit. And here are a lot of the earthly things that we are to focus on according to the world in which we live. Are we going to focus on those things, or are we going to focus on things of God? When you think about all the things the world pushes towards as the things that are important, are those things important, or are things of God important to us? And then be reminded, in these two you once walked. And our tendency here is when we see these lists of various sins, and by the way, I'm very appreciative of Paul not mentioning gluttony on the week that we're going into Thanksgiving, but it's in there somewhere too, not in Colossians 3. In these two, you once walked. So if you didn't struggle in the list of the sexual sins, or you don't struggle with anger, or you don't struggle with this or that, do not look at someone else who has sinned in a different way that you sin, and think of them as lesser and you as better. Don't look at those people and say, man, what a mess they are, and how together I have it, because that begins to sound an awful lot like the Pharisee and the tax collector in their prayers, doesn't it? And we find ourselves on the wrong side of that equation. So remind yourself, and then remind yourself also you're forgiven of it, but remind yourself, I haven't always been perfect either. And if we're truly honest with ourselves, I'm also not currently perfect. I have places I mess up. In these two you once walked, you were living in them. So this was not only stuff you did, it almost became kind of some of who you are. And if you were to look back to some people that knew you in those times that you're nostalgic about, the version of you they remember would probably make you uncomfortable for some of us. I've met up with people that I haven't seen since college, and when they describe college Brian to me, I don't like that. I don't want to be college Brian. I want to be who I am now, and honestly, I want to be kind of a better version of that. You have put off the old self with its practices. You have left that behind. And I don't know how best for us to visualize that, but I wish we could just get that in our minds all the time. This is not who I am anymore. I am not going to be that person. I'm going to be something else. So you have put off the old self with its practices. And in verse 10 he says, and have put on the new self, which is being renewed in knowledge after the image of its creator. So you have put on the new self. And that new self is being renewed in knowledge in the image of its creator, all the way back to Genesis 1. You were created in the image of God. And now God, through his power, the one who can do, as we talked about at the beginning, exceedingly abundantly, more than we can ask or imagine, he is able, whatever you think you can't let loose of, whatever thing you think, I keep falling back into this, I don't know what to do, he is able to renew you, to change you from that. And he can help you to do the thing you couldn't do otherwise. As Paul would say in Romans 12 and verse 2, do not be conformed to the world. I almost feel like Romans 12:2 is kind of his, if Paul was doing a book report on Colossians 3, 1 through 11, it would be Romans 12:2. Do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewal of your mind, that by testing you may discern what is the will of God, what is good and acceptable and perfect. You can be who God wants you to be by living in this way, being transformed from the ways of this world. You are transformed and you are being renewed. God is still working on you. God is still helping you be who you need to be. In the verse 11, Here there is not Greek and Jew, circumcised and uncircumcised, barbarian, Scythian, slave, free, Democrat, Republican, cowboy, Sooner, tide, male, female, all of these different things that divide us, rich, poor, native, non-native, all of them relevant, all of them something that it's okay to look at the heritage of and have some level of pride in that, or to want to know about that, or to tell people about that. But when it comes to being a Christian, all of those things are secondary. And not just secondary, way, way down the line. They are just not even relevant to ourselves here. Christ is all and in all. So these divisions that we create, we cannot be divided by earthly divisions. Now, are we, if we're going to be honest with ourselves? Probably. I am very pleased here at a place like Southwest that I don't feel a lot of division for the most part. I know we have our moments where one of our teams wins and one doesn't, or all of those things. I know we have our moments around election time where we get divided. I know we have little things here and there. We're a pretty unified group of people. But all of these earthly divisions that people try to push us in the categories, that's just going to keep getting worse. And are we going to allow that to be, or are we going to remember that we are going to rise above that because Christ is all? Not Christ is most. Not even though you have all that stuff, Christ can kind of maybe help you overcome that. Just Christ is all. So all of those other things, if they were to go away tomorrow, if they decided there are too many injuries in college football, we're not going to play it anymore. Oh man, could you imagine? What would I do on Saturdays? I don't know. If they decided tomorrow our two-party system is so messed up, we're just going to scrap it and start over. If they decided tomorrow to do any number of things that would change those groups that we have been in forever, could we deal? And if we believe the words of Paul here in Colossians chapter 3 and verse 11, absolutely. Because Christ is all. And when you have all, you don't need anything else. You are not lacking. When you're getting ready to make up your Christmas list, we just started doing this in our house the other day. Sure, it's fun, and there's little things that I've thought, hey, that'd be kind of neat to have and all that stuff, but Christ is all. When you think of what is missing for me, Christ is all. And so when we begin to look to those things, is Christ at the forefront of all of that? Set your minds on heavenly things, but do not forget that as you do that, it changes everything here. If we're so focused on heaven, we forget about here, we've missed the point. It changes everything about what we think and what we do, and the world around us will take notice of that. This morning, if you have not followed him, he is all. He changes everything in your life. And you can put to death all of that stuff that has held you back and kept you down and made life not worthwhile, and all of that can change. You can set your minds on things that really matter. You can be baptized into him, and you can put on Christ in your life. Or if you have walked away from that for any number of reasons, know that you're supposed to put away the old and put on the new. And you can come back to that today. If there's some way we can help you, please come while we stand and sing.